Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I'm very glad to meet you. My name is Judy and I like travel and history. Today we're going to hopscotch through part 2 of Germany's famous romantic road, picking up just a few miles south of where we left off last time, which was in Rothenburg ob der Tauber. The full length of the road, you'll recall, stretches all the way from Würzburg to Füssen. If you wanted to visit every single interesting site, you'd need not just a car, but a couple of weeks of time. Since most of us don't have either of those available, today we'll move around and just take a look at a few of the interesting remaining stops on the Armchair Traveler. But first, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Medieval villages share some commonalities. People got together not just to make friends and be happy and influence people, but to be safe. So most are sited somewhere defensible, like a hilltop or a cliff, or perhaps even tucked in the elbow of a windy river. Early in each city's existence, most built some kind of serious defenses, often including a fort, walls, and towers. Inside the defenses, normally they would start with one or two small buildings, but gradually, as the population expanded, you would find a church, often these days grown to cathedral status. And there's always a market square. After all, people do need a place to not just shop, but meet and greet. Dinkelsbuehl is Rothenburg's little sister, and sometimes, for those of us who might be just a tad crowd-phobic, a great stop. It might not have all the bells and whistles and fame of excitement of some of the other cities, but if you're interested in seeing intact medieval walls and strolling through a pleasant town square with a modicum of calm, peace, and quiet, this place might just be the ticket. The current inner or Old Town probably dates from the early 12th century, around 1130 AD, although most historians think that an earlier settlement, possibly dating from 730 AD, was located near here. In this image you can see St. George's Church, a late Gothic building from the 1490s. Notice it's attached to a much older looking tower. It's now a bell tower, which was originally built in the early 1200s. There were plans for that tower, which was never a part of the city walls, but apparently whoever built it ran out of money to build anything else. The image on the top right shows the fabulous view from the bell tower. The lower right gives us a peek at the market square. Dinkelsbuehl's city walls date from the 10th century. The towers are somewhat later, and they still surround the city. The 30 Years' War, which ran from 1618 to 1648, took a toll on this city, which was forced to surrender to the Swedish army in 1632, but was not burnt to the ground. More than 4 centuries later, the town escaped the ravages of the end of World War II without much damage. The perfectly preserved historic town square is one of Europe's most important cultural monuments. The town is also the home of the head office of the Romantic Road Corporation and has been since 1985. The city towers actually show quite a bit of variation because they weren't added all at the same time. This one, in the inset, features a kind of shed roof rather than a pointed roof or even a conical topper. St. George's Church dates from the mid-15th century and is built in Gothic style, with this enormous bell tower we saw a moment ago from the front, and here seen from the side. I initially imagined that the bell tower was part of the original city walls, but I had that part wrong. It predates the church by at least a century or two. The tower was originally not planned to be a bell tower at all. It was a freestanding structure. The ambitious plans for the rest of the area had to be put aside because they ran out of money. It was there, it was built, it was sturdy, so the church architects just extended the church building to include it. The church became popular with pilgrims in later centuries because of the highly decorated altars inside. It's also possible to climb the tower during weekend afternoons if there's good weather during the summer. On the top right you can see the graceful apse end of the building with its conical roof, and to the bottom a glimpse of the huge interior pillars that support the entire nave. Stained glass windows are built up out of pieces, and the pieces are generally connected with lead. Oftentimes, they're supported on the outside by decorative pieces of stonework. What you see here is called the pretzel window. In the Middle Ages, guilds and other groups commonly donated to churches and cathedrals, sometimes paying for an entire chapel, but others had less money and paid for something a little less ambitious. The stonework top of this window clearly shows us who the donors were. They were pretzel bakers. This gloriously decorated gingerbread confection is the so-called German house. In these photos, you can see the face in just a tiny section of one of the carved decorations. The building itself dates from 1416 and is preserved, though I'm sure modernized substantially, as a modern and rather expensive hotel and restaurant. The building started out as a home for the town mayor, a man named Hans Drechsel. He was part of an important wealthy family in the area, which eventually worked its way up into the nobility in the imperial court. Dinkelsbuehl got tangled up, you'll recall, in the 30 Years' War, and in 1632, the citizens were forced to surrender to the Swedish forces. Every town worth its salt has some kind of foundation myth, and perhaps this is one of them. The story goes that when the Swedish army besieged the town, a teenage girl took the children to the Swedish general to beg for mercy. The Swedish general had recently lost his young son to illness, and a boy who approached him so closely resembled his own son that he decided to spare the town. Dinkelsbuehl remembers the salvation of the city. It's not often that people celebrate when a city is defeated in war. This reenactment is played out by many of the town's residents and features an array of citizens dressed up like Swedish soldiers, like local people, attacking and defending the city, and children dressed up in traditional garb coming to witness the event. It sounds like a fun thing to see. Nordlingen has city walls and places to walk, but a more interesting attraction to me is the discovery that it's actually built in a meteor crater. I've never seen a meteor crater. The hollow is about 25 kilometers across and rises up to a low circular stony ridge that surrounds the town. It's just enormous. Until the 1960s, the best guess was this was a leftover caldera from an ancient volcano, but no one really knew or much cared. The area has been known and documented since the days of the Roman Empire, when it was a part of the Roman province of Raetia. People were living in the area a long time before the Romans got here, however. The depression is ridged up, and there are caves on the edge, which were rediscovered in the early 1900s. I say rediscovered because inside, archaeologists discovered 33 human skulls dating to the Mesolithic period, possibly as long as 8,000 years ago. For centuries, Nordlingen's more recent residents probably didn't much think about the local terrain. There's no sign of a disappeared massive river here or anything else that would have accounted for the hollow. It was just there. In 1970, however, scientists figured out this had to be a meteor crater. The church tower we looked at a few minutes ago played a major role in the discovery. When geologists examined the stone in the tower, they already knew it had to come from the ridge above the hollow and realized it was something called shocked or damaged quartz. It could only have been produced by a meteor. The area was interesting to NASA scientists because there aren't many accessible meteor craters like this one here on planet Earth. The landing site for Apollo 14 was in a very heavily craterized area, and one of the science goals of the mission was to sample the ejecta, that's the material that made up the ridge above the hollow, from the meteor impact. This is an easily accessible large crater, making it a convenient analog for lunar explorers. Because of this, it was used as a location to train the Apollo 14 astronauts so they'd have some idea of what to expect and how to approach investigating similar structures and rocks on the moon. Astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell, as well as Apollo 14 backup astronauts Eugene Cernan and Joe Engle, trained here for a couple of days in August of 1970. Unfortunately, things don't always work out the way they are planned. To the dismay of the geologists, Shepard and Mitchell were not able to reach the rim of the crater as they had planned, although they came close. Nordlingen has a complete preserved medieval city wall with 12 towers and covered defensive passages which completely surround the old town. You can climb up and walk on them if your knees are up to climbing the steps. The walls date back to 1327, when the then Emperor Ludwig the Bavarian ordered their construction. The walls helped the city withstand a siege during the 30 Years' War. Centuries later, the citizenry wanted to rip down the walls because they imagined they would never be useful again. King Ludwig I of Bavaria thought differently and put the wall under his personal protection. He forbade its further demolition. One interesting feature here is the small houses called Kazarmen, set up as lean-tos and built directly onto the city wall. Once upon a time, I'm told, the city soldiers lived there. St. George's Church dates from the last year of the 15th century and is one of the largest churches in Germany. It comes complete with a 90-meter tall tower that's a real tourist draw, since once you climb it, you not only see the city, but get a kind of a view of that meteor crater. Shown here are two picture postcard views of the church dating from around 1918, and one of the interior side aisles showing part of the organ and the beautiful vaulted roofing. This is a modern view of the church shown from the apse inn and with a view of the famous tower in the background. Our next stop is Harburg Castle, one that will merit a full-day expedition when I visit in 2024. It's said to be one of the most impressive medieval castles in Germany and comes complete with tours, a church, dungeon, walls, towers, playgrounds, gates, staterooms, residential buildings, a well, a prince's palace, and even a restaurant. The basis of the castle dates back 900 years, and it sits on a cliff overlooking the river, a great defensive location. Years ago, apparently, Michael Jackson tried to buy the entire estate, which he called the castle of his dreams, but he failed. This view shows the castle hulking over, or possibly just guarding, the settlement of Harburg down in the valley. The castle now belongs, as it has for nearly 3 centuries, to the Count of Oettingen-Wallerstein. Clearly, it was designed as a defensive structure, at least initially, given its location and layout, one which features 2 sets of walls and numerous watchtowers. The first image gives you a view of some of the castle buildings and the well. A well was a castle necessity. Although there is a river, as you'll see in a minute, at the base of the hill, during a siege there would have been no way to access it. The second view is of one of the courtyards and the still standing and handily roofed over castle walls. I've never seen castle walls roofed over like this, but then again, it's much colder in this part of Germany than it is perhaps in France or Italy. Next is a detail of the wooden portcullis. It shows some lattice spikes. Finally, we have a rather romantic-looking painting giving an impression of what the castle must have looked like from the river. Our last stop today is Augsburg, the oldest city in Bavaria. Excavations have uncovered an early Bronze Age settlement at the site, so people were living in the area long before the Romans discovered it and viewed it as an important, and more importantly, strategically defensible site. If you speak just a little German, as I do, you might be fooled into thinking that the name somehow refers to an eye, since the first part of it, Aug, looks like the root word for eye in German. And that would be a good guess, or so I thought, but it's also wrong. Augusta Vindelicorum was originally a Roman city. Although it is named after the emperor at that time, Augustus, it was actually built by his stepson, the Roman general Drusus. The original Roman settlement was destroyed during and after the fall of the Roman Empire, but people continued to live here, and it became the seat of the powerful Augsburg prince-bishops. This photo gives you a spectacular aerial view of the cathedral, which was founded in the 11th century but has been remodeled in Gothic style since. But it's mostly famous for its stained glass windows, 5 of which are considered the oldest of their kind on the planet. The cathedral is located on the site of a pre-existing 4th century Roman-era building, but excavators don't think it was a church. The site was included, however, within the ancient Roman walls of the city. The first known church here was documented and dates back to 822. The current building was commissioned in 1043 by Bishop Henry III and was completed a mere 20 years later. The 2 towers, which are visible from the whole city, were completed in 1075. Between 1331 and 1431, a lot of Gothic elements were added. One of the most important features of the cathedral is a series of stained glass windows. 5 originals survive, dating from the 12th century, and show us characters from the Old Testament. This one, shown on the right, depicts Jonah. Look at the bottom and you'll see the open mouth of some kind of sea monster. Usually the Bible tells us that Jonah was swallowed by a whale, but whales didn't live in the Red Sea or the Sea of Galilee, at least not as far as I know, and in any event didn't have wicked-looking teeth like that. I think big fish would probably be a better translation. Like many German cities, this one suffered from substantial damage during World War II. The city was a significant military production center during World War II and the natural target of Allied bomb runs, one in 1942 and one in 1944. Unfortunately, much of the downtown area was destroyed in the 1944 action. Dropping a lot of explosives can have immediate effects, as it did here, burning out much of the city center, but the effects can be discovered often much later. During the Christmas holiday of 2016, some 50,000 residents had to be evacuated to remove a nearly 4-ton bomb. Fortunately, it had been a dud. Like all medieval cities, Augsburg was protected by city walls. This so-called Red Gate seen here dates likely from the 14th century as part of the city's fortification, although it was extensively renovated in the 17th century in the Baroque style you see now. It features a distinctive red color, which is believed to have been inspired by the red and white colors and coat of arms of the city. This is a central market. The tower on the left is called the Perlachturm. It's 70 meters tall and is a bell tower in front of the Romanesque St. Peter's Church. It originated as a watchtower back in the 10th century. The building on the right is the City Hall. In an age when much architecture and money was sunk into church buildings, this one, built between 1615 and 1624, is one of the most important secular buildings in the Renaissance style north of the Alps. It was built on the site of an old city hall. The city fathers decided they didn't want a tower, but the architect, one Elias Hull, insisted on the famous onion domes you see on top of the two gables. During the devastating British bombing raid in 1944, the City Hall was hit a number of times by high explosive and incendiary bombs, completely burning out the exterior. It was rebuilt after the war. Between 1980 and 1984, the facade of the building was restored to its original colors, according to what they could find in historical records. Inside the Renaissance building, what had been damaged during the war was restored to its original splendor, and it was reopened to celebrate the city's 2000th anniversary celebration. Today, the building is protected due to its historic and cultural importance by the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. Sometimes when I study history, I remember that the more things change, the more they remain the same. Every city has memorable families, but they tend to come from the nobility, the clergy, and the arts. And Augsburg was no different. Its most famous and influential family had an incredible effect on European history and the rise and fall of nations through their financial wheelings and dealings. They were called the Fueggers. Originally, the family were weavers, but they eventually switched from the Weavers' Guild to the Trade Guild. Within a century after that, they were listed in the city revenue list as the 7th richest family in the city. They became an export-import business, used their profits to buy concessions for example, the largest silver works in the world in the Austrian Tyrol, and even more importantly, to advance credit to rulers of states who were in debt due to the ruinous wars and extravagance. Within 20 years, they became a bank, financial advisors and creditors of the Pope, the Habsburg emperors, even King Henry VIII of England. In the 16th century, the family was raised to nobility and started work on their most famous Augsburg legacy. A little surprisingly, considering all the greed that went into their becoming as rich as they were, it consisted of housing for poor families who did not want to rely on charity. The rent was very low, along with a requirement that the renters pray daily for the Fueggers. Spouses of inhabitants who died were allowed to remain, provided they could continue to pay the rent. This social housing was very badly damaged by aerial bombing that we talked about earlier, but the family council took the decision to rebuild the quarter in 1944, and the work was finished by 1948. It was renovated in the 1960s and 70s. You can see a small section of the buildings on the left. On the right, you can see what had been an entryway to their private home dating from the 1600s, but which is today the entrance to their bank. Our final stop on the tour shows us once again that you cannot judge a book by its cover, or in this case, the interior of a church by the exterior. If I had to judge just based on what the picture of the exterior looks like, I would have passed this place by. About an hour south of Augsburg stands Wieskirche, which is one of the most famous works from the Rococo period of art and architecture in this part of Germany. Like many other pilgrimage churches in the area, the prominence of the church came about through a religious wonder or miracle. This time, the story goes that a farmer had stolen a fairly ordinary statue of the scourged Savior and had installed it, perhaps in his kitchen garden. In 1738, someone in the family claimed that they had seen tears in the eyes of the statue at evening prayers. For all I know, it might have been the thief's wife. Eventually, visitors came to see the statue and to pray, and it was decided a new building was needed to accommodate them, and of course to promote the religious wonder and economic benefits that would accrue to the area. In the mid-18th century, the current church was built by the Zimmermann brothers, who were local artists and architects whose work in this period can be found all over Europe. The style is the elaborate gilt stucco and art mixed in with white that has been a feature of this Rococo period and which can be found in other Bavarian and Tyrolean churches and historical buildings. The church was renovated in the 1980s to protect the original decoration. It is on the UNESCO World Heritage Protected Buildings. This is our last stop in Bavaria and our last stop in Germany. Come back next week when we're going to go someplace warm and sunny, Valletta on the island of Malta, here on the Armchair Traveler. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen.